Good morning. It's 2 o'clock in New York City, Sunday morning, the 20th of July. Welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 34, Critique of Contemporary Architecture, the deficiency of a non-organic architecture in the present day. My name is Bruce Gemmel. I'm a researcher and a draftsman in architecture and design and construction. This is a series of ruminations I do once a week at this time to kind of put together these ideas that I've been thinking about pretty much across the last, basically encompasses my whole life, but I'd say for the most part, seriously over the last 40 years. Anyway, I started these on another platform, which turned out to not be very sympathetic. I then came onto this platform and kind of redid the pieces that I had before. As a result, I felt much more dissatisfied with what I have here. So I've decided to continue on this platform. Let me run down what we've done. I basically started in December, and as a result, have kind of come through to now as a result of what we have. I started, my first lecture was called The Operation of the Metaphor, and that was on the 1st of December, 2024, sorry. So that was the first one, and it kind of allowed me to kind of talk about what I felt was the kind of prime generative strategy about what I think I came to understand was the kind of heart and soul of my work. Then I talked about how that split into three specific parts. It was a natural, an artificial, and what I call the sociological component. The sociological component I kind of classified as what I call unbreakable bonds. I also referred that to ideas within the work of Alfred North Whitehead, specifically his Adventures of Ideas, and looked at it as a kind of repository or a kind of precipitate of basically aspects of civilization. From there, I went into the idea of criticism. Criticism was the first idea I kind of dealt with because I felt it was a very fundamental idea and an important idea. I felt it was something that kind of needed to be discussed in terms of its value and its ability to be misunderstood within our society. From there, I went to the art of finding what needs to be said, and then a view of criticism as an indicator of societal health. As a result of seeing that, I felt as if it was kind of a good idea to kind of start to define that as something that was important. So the idea of unbreakable bonds, which is something I've talked about from time to time, was something that I felt needed to be discussed in terms of the kind of like still within the operation of the metaphor, but specifically within the operation of the metaphor, specifically within terms of how it basically kind of had a societal component. And it could be viewed as two things. It could be viewed as its value to the society, and also kind of indicator of how that kind of like could be indicated through the way in which it was treated. Criticism was the first piece we dealt with in that regard. From there, talked about the architecture as a verb, as a process, and then started talking specifically about more things specifically related to what I do. I talked about the idea of drawing as a central idea, not just as a kind of delineator, but as a kind of as a generative strategy, as an operational strategy. The drawing is really at the core of kind of like unlocking the imagination as a result of kind of being able to kind of give manifestation to the metaphorical impulse. From that point on, let's see, we went to kind of like basically some philosophical ideas. I talked about the authority in ideas, and I kind of talked a little bit about some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight in terms of the nature of architecture as a kind of critique of the contemporary circumstance related to my background. I talked about my past architecture, talked about my youth. I talked about recent past architecture, my work as a student and as a professor, and then the aftermath, which was basically post 1990, when I started to kind of began to kind of develop my own ideas independently once I had kind of left academia. Then we kind of talked about an indicator of societal health. We talked about that in relationship to the unbreakable bond, emotional attachment to ideas, and the kind of fear of that. And we talked about Hume's idea that basically we don't really know. We know that the passions drive us, but in terms of that, we kind of can't let the emotional attachment overrule the ability to discern good judgment. And then basically went through a series of other concepts, talked about beauty and truth in relationship to the later parts of Adventures of Ideas, when we talked about that in relationship to the way in which kind of people kind of delineate. And then that was the kind of beginning. Those 26 were the first series of piece talks that I had given. From then, I started new pieces, and that was where I started in terms of entanglement and conditioning, talked about measurement. Basically, what I did after that, when I started again, was I kind of saw the fact that there was a need to talk about my specific desires. And I split my specific desires into kind of organic impulses and inorganic impulses, what I called my organics or organisms and my mechanisms. Then after that, we talked about entanglements and conditioning, which was the organic impulse. And I talked about measurement and talked about a specific idea that Poincaré had raised in the Adventures of Ideas that was quoted by Whitehead. Then I talked about entanglement and conditioning, which was, again, a second part of that idea, the fact that these things kind of became something that was kind of starting to operate in my mind as I worked. Then we talked about the nature of perspective within the metaphor. Then we talked about understanding and judgment in regards to authority. Last week, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the unbreakable bond of freedom and tolerance. We talked about last week in terms of value and consequence. And this week, the topic is the critique of the present non-organic architecture. Okay, so with that said, I would like to go to the piece that we talk about every week, which is Adventures in Julie. So, okay. So basically, I'll give you a kind of beginning about what we'll talk about here, which is the deficiencies of a non-organic architecture in the present day. The first thing is that it's inorganic. And why is that important? I think that's important because it seems as if, with the notable exception of humans, every other organic society or network has had the ability to kind of embed itself within the networks of nature, as opposed to humans. So that inorganic, abiotic aspect, which kind of seems to kind of like still linger within our society, at least in the kind of like contemporary circumstance of kind of like what you would call world architecture, though there are kind of some indigenous places where it actually is more holistic. However, it kind of seems as if that's at the sacrifice of some of the things that we've been able to do, such as technology, and kind of like link technology to reason. I don't think the two are, inseparable. I don't think the two are unresolvable. But I do believe as if like some of the things that we're starting to see and start to understand leads us in this direction. I think one of the things that was for me very important was I saw the fact that there was an actual kind of like organic impulse in American architecture that was growing and was becoming very strong in the 20th century. However, it did not get a chance to manifest because of like some nefarious activities that kind of seem to have suppressed its natural impulse and kind of subverted the kind of study of architecture, especially within the academic institutions. And as the academic institutions became more and more powerful, it was definitely something that was failing. But back, one of the things that, interesting in my time in the profession is the fact that it was very common. I think it's still possible that an individual can have an apprenticeship without going to college. I know that at least in terms of the way in which your college years were weighed, there was a consequence in terms of the fact that there was a formula one would derive in terms of the relationship between experience and academic time spent. it wasn't an advantage for professorial work, but there was one for kind of educational, kind of like study. So I think there was like, if I remember the formula properly, one needed, the magic number was 12 to qualify for the architectural exam. One could have 12 years of apprenticeship, and if one had education, the 5-year Bachelor of Architecture and accredited architectural program, which is what I had, basically added up to 10, but you had to minus one, so it was 9. So you needed to have 3 years of architectural experience. And then I believe that graduate degree was different. Master's degree, you would kind of end up like, I think you had to have, you had 6, and then there was some other thing because you had gone to undergraduate school too, and it kind of added up to some number too. But the apprenticeship was basically something that one, needed as well before one could qualify, as well as the fact that, you know, the academic component was weighed against that. So anyway, that was basically where that derived from. But it was still something that in my time, I'm not sure what the circumstances are because I have no idea how the architectural exam is administered. But there's always these generational fallacies and these generational kind of like things where, oh, it was harder when we did it, it's easier now, or it was harder now because they do this, or things have changed. But anyway, so are you ready? We're going to talk about This Week in Julie.
Sure, if you
Okay,
want.
sit in.
I'm gonna get impaled.
So, what's going on this week in Julie?
Oh, not much.
So tell us.
Well, I started a new drawing at the Met yesterday. Continued it today. The subject is retrotransposons, also known as jumping genes, which is a new research area in microbiology, and I'm using the highly toxic cane toad as the operating metaphor. So that's what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Anything else we should know about?
Well, I'm using Christopher Dresser vase as the artifact, as the piece at the Met that is the dominant piece upon which I am hanging and laying these metaphors that I have invented. And this particular vase has a series of abstract patterns, gilding, enamel, and has an owl. So I was searching for an artifact with anomalous, or what I call,
Sorry. No, sorry. Just very tired.
Yeah, another feeling. It's been pretty draining. Anyway, I was looking for objects at the Met which have anomalous design incursions that were done on purpose by the potter, by the sculptor, not drawings or paintings, but 3-dimensional objects where something very unexpected pops into the design, where it's more inserted rather than organically sprung, something that doesn't seem or feel innate to the environment of the piece or inherent at the genesis of the piece. Not an afterthought, but a deliberate incursion.
Okay, be interested to see how that works out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you started the drawing this week.
Yeah, I
and
can
you kind of
hold
have,
it
yeah,
up.
I'd like to see it.
Sure. No problem. I had to get the garbage. It reeked. I don't know what was in there, but it smelled god awful. I saw a bug around there. I had to get it out of here immediately. Should I just hold it up?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Small. What? I'm not in the frame, so I mean,
Yeah.
either angle it or
I'll
something.
hold it up.
Yeah. I mean, I can hold it up. No one's gonna see it.
Okay.
So this is my drawing that I just started yesterday. Only had about 45 minutes to work on it yesterday. Worked on it for about an hour and a half earlier this evening. What you are looking at is the gilded rim, the gilded lip, the turquoise and ultramarine and gold rimmed enamel abstract patterns of this British vase, which happens to be in the British wing at the Met. It's either Christopher Dresser or Minton. It's in the Christopher Dresser case, but the labels on that case are very unspecific. They have sort of generalized tags, which is odd, and no specific labels for any of the pieces in those cases. So, I mean, it looks just like a dresser piece because there is a dresser piece where he used a beetle, which I actually did in another drawing. So I believe this is one of his. And you'll see the cane toad face, which I've actually worked in and am hybridizing with the pattern of the vase. The pattern lifts off and becomes a DNA chain. And what you're seeing is our line 1 retrotransposons. I'll explain what that is. Line 1 are the most injurious, the most devilish, and the most problematic of our pieces of our ancient DNA, not for M with 1,000,000 years old, but B with 1,000,000,000. These are ancient pieces of our DNA that are still in our bodies. They have found leaping around. They actually insert themselves into our DNA and rewrite our DNA and cause a host of cancers, of diseases, of autoimmune problems. They're pretty devilish, and line 1 are the worst offenders, and there are 100 copies, they estimate, of line 1 retrotransposons. They convert themselves into a form of RNA and then back to a kind of, how should I say, doppelganger ersatz DNA, which is not your real DNA, but masquerades, and they jump around wreaking havoc, actually. So that's what is happening here. So you can see that the pattern on the vase lifts off and becomes a section of line 1 retrotransposons.
Interesting. Be interested to see how this develops.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a good start.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. So, as a result of that, that kind of like is a good place to start with the discussion here. So, this is simply my critique of contemporary architecture and its deficiencies. Now, when I say that I feel as if these deficiencies are that it's inorganic, that's because I believe that we should have a truly organic architecture. So this is simply my particular obsession. It's not an obsession that needs to kind of exist for anyone else, but I do believe that we are headed in this direction, and I think it would be to our benefit to be able to understand and appreciate this desire. One of the advantages, I believe, of today's architectural education is the fact that with the, like I said, the somewhat nefarious circumstances that kind of led to the suppression of the kind of natural organic impulse of the United States architecture, I feel as if that kind of secondary circumstance seems to have been kind of like become kind of like lacked as it kind of moves off. It was kind of somewhat impotent and frail, and that kind of what I call the Euro fetish circumstance seems to kind of wane to a great degree. It's certainly at the point where it no longer has the energy to suppress what it had previously. Anyway, so why is that necessary? Like I said, I think the reality is the fact that the hermetic nature and the isolationist attitude that humans have in relationship to their environment is, I think, something that is unique and not beneficial. So I'd say that this is part of that kind of fetish obsession that kind of came over here after the Second World War. And I don't think it was the fault of any individual who practiced this type of architecture. I think it was just the short-sightedness and the lack of understanding of the kind of complete depth of the architectural enterprise. I think now with the kind of understanding of technology and kind of like the benefit of kind of like seeing the these kind of like changes in technology, things like tiny houses and deployables and other types of architecture. We're starting to see in the architectural schools the possibility of kind of being able to challenge some of these kind of fairly kind of retrograde ideas. It's kind of like coming into a kind of situation. And I mean, this was something I still remembered in school too. I felt that some of the incredibly kind of superficial formalisms that were taking place were incredibly ignorant and incredibly kind of like imbecilic. But this was the obsession that kind of seemed to reign at the time. Anyway, good to see that these things are kind of like moving off. But I think what happened was people weren't really capable of understanding or appreciating the fact that there was a kind of unique advantage in the American landscape that kind of gave a rise to a certain circumstance. But anyway, let's go into these specifics. Now, one of the things that we've been able to do as critics is kind of see situations where we've seen the kind of chink in the armor, the kind of possibility of introducing some new ideas. But one of the things that kind of seems to always kind of rear its ugly head is what I would call this kind of anthropocentric, isolationist, hermetic, inorganic attitude of which the architectural enterprise kind of inserts itself into the landscape. And I feel as if like some of the things that are kind of somewhat ironic or even kind of somewhat foolish come from the fact that, you know, whereas other enterprises that kind of surround us, like the civil and mechanical, these other things, somewhat have the similar retrograde perspective, but at the same time are at least trying to introduce things slowly. But I think the whole sustainability circumstance, the whole idea of a green circumstance is nothing's greener than nature. So that seems to be something where that kind of sustainability kind of is a truly organic architecture is, is like the ultimate solution to what?
I don't know, you keep looking at the ceiling.
No. Yeah, just kind of looking around. I look around. I remember one time I was asked in school, I think it was in fourth grade, I mean, being autistic or kind of like, if it was autistic, I don't know, but they didn't really, I just had a sense to not really think things through before I said them. But in fourth grade, I was looking out the window and the teacher said, so what's that going on out the window is more important than what's going on in here. And without really thinking, I said, yes, because obviously if it hadn't been, I wouldn't have been looking out the window. It did cause a lot of a ruckus, and I kind of ended up, I think, getting detention for it. But the point was, I was simply saying what I was doing. Eye contact for me is something I had to teach myself because it wasn't something that came natural to me. So if my eyes wander or I kind of seem distracted, it's that I'm constantly absorbing the things around me as well as the time when I'm kind of like looking at things and talking.
We have leaks all the time, and I thought there was another leak.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of logical, actually.
Okay. So I'd say, Julie, you've been with me when we've gone to some of these architectural juries, and actually, one of the things I think, coming from the tradition that you come in at Cooper Union, you understand the idea of the interconnectedness of architecture, engineering, and art. So it seemed to me, I mean, aside from your natural affinities and your natural abilities, it seemed perfectly reasonable to see you in an architectural environment. So given what we've seen in terms of the environment that we live in, the world of architecture, and now academia, what would you say are your concerns with these things as I'm presenting them?
Which aspect? There are many things.
Well, I'm saying
Gotta be more
if there
specific.
is, being on these reviews and kind of being in these architectural panels, what do you feel are the challenges to the contemporary architecture that you feel as if they're not really being kind of like taken into account?
Well, as someone who's been invited to the juries also, um, yeah, I think part of the problem is that what might look like a radical building or an innovative kind of a design on the outside almost always turns out to be superficial. It turns out to be usually skin deep, and the interior of the building, however avant-garde it looks, turns out to be extremely basic and predictable inside. That the outside tends to be window dressing, and the structure of the outside is not reflected in the interior architecture of the building.
Mhm.
In fact, the interior is usually a box with standard rooms, standard hallways, standard lobbies. There's usually nothing very innovative in the interior of a building that might seem cutting edge externally. And there's not a marriage of the internal and external structure. In fact, they exist, unfortunately, completely independently of each other.
Yeah, one of the things I think was always funny, and they always used kind of like this kind of a joke in the term that like would happen with things that people would buy was that someone would slap on a paint job and call it new, but in fact it was really just the same kind of like 1950s or whatever it was, kind of being retrofit. I mean, it was kind of like the use. I almost feel as if like contemporary architecture is almost like this used car salesman kind of approach, where it's like you kind of like slap on a new paint job and you open up the door and you go inside and you realize like this is a 30-year-old car, and I think in some cases some of these cars are like 100 years old, because we really have not affected any kind of change in terms of our approach to the way in which we engage the social activity of, of these buildings, of these activities. And I think it's probably because we kind of created this kind of like loop that we can't kind of release ourselves from. We are kind of socially hermetic, and as a result, we kind of find ourselves like incapable of kind of self-reflection. So as a result, we kind of don't really pay attention to some of the situations that we've actually created for ourselves. I mean, I think it's an incredibly sad circumstance when we kind of see architecture become just a high priced consumer good. I mean, really, it's like, you buy the best refrigerator, you buy the best toaster, you buy the best car. And if you're fortunate enough, you can buy the best house, but it's really just a kind of like a collection of kind of like choices that one would kind of click off of a list of, this is the kind of, microwave oven I want to have, or the kind of, kind of like kitchen arrangement I want to have. It seems to be as if like there's a certain kind of obsequious obedience amongst even the architects and the kind of like uh, those people who are kind of the prominent architects. Now, I have no problem with people kind of doing what they see is right for them. I have no problem with either kind of like corporate architecture or boutique architecture. I just don't see them as kind of like making a compelling argument for their existence. So as a result, I feel that the concern is like, what are the things that I feel are necessary? And one of the critiques I find is the fact that like there is always a circumstance between the individual and the social interactions. I find that there's a tremendous lacking of this as a kind of like a universal kind of discussion. Another thing I find is that like there is what I would call an accidental domestication that we kind of like I find ironic, but is actually kind of quite telling. I mean, as a result of us creating this domain, we have created what we call pests, but at the same time, they call it friends. And in fact, one of the things that Julie was actually a theme that was in Julie's painting that's coming up about Baron Schmiedel, is the fact that the four rodents who have entrusted their lives to this somewhat kind of buffoonish individual have done so simply because they prefer the life of indoors to the life of outdoors. So as a result, we've accidentally domesticated quite a few friends that we don't view as actually friends. I mean, the cockroach, the pigeon, the rat, the mouse, and various, the silverfish, the millipede. We've domesticated and other kind of birds. We've domesticated them accidentally because of the fact that we've created this kind of like very improper, unhealthy circumstance of what I would call, the surface. In organic life, the idea of a kind of impenetrable surface is a kind of fairly rare phenomenon, yet we've tried to create this in our architecture. And I think like a permeable surface is a kind of much more realistic and healthy kind of circumstance. The world ends where architecture starts. And that seems to be a kind of very foolish and kind of like impossible kind of reality. So we strive to kind of create this hermetic isolationist environment in this kind of anthropocentric realm of still believing of the superiority of us as a species. So as a result, we've kind of come to this without really kind of reasoning through the fact that we're either wrong or we've failed. But when we look back at the situation of a kind of more kind of like broader, more organic circumstance, we realize that these kind of things were natural and basically kind of beneficial, and certainly things that we could have taken advantage of. One of the things that's happened to me over the course of my kind of like my job history in the architectural endeavors is I've kind of come to understand that it's not just a complexity of a kind of creation of an architectural artifact, but there's a tremendous amount of more potential for these things than we kind of give them credit to. There was in fact, a very interesting exhibit that was given by a friend of ours, who was someone who we knew through the Entomological Society at the Museum of Natural History, where I think the New Jersey Liberty Science Center or someone took a typical office building and analyzed all the organic life that has basically entrenched itself there as a result of the opportunities that we've created, either for shelter or sustenance. And it was never our intention, but it now has become the reality. So that was one of the things that I would kind of say was like that accidental domestication. We see that certain animals prefer the company of humans. One of the things I always find funny is if I go to the beach, I find that the gulls are perfectly much more happy to eat out of the garbage pails than go out looking for fish. And I could get it to the point where, like, why go and work for it when it's right here? So I've always wondered why it is that we don't kind of make that a more kind of reasonable exchange. I mean, I feel as if like that is something we now are very aware of. We see this. So, one of the things that was interesting is in the 19th century, pigs were enlisted to kind of rummage through the refuse in New York City as part of the Department of Sanitation. So, this idea of an organic component refuse is something that is a natural kind of inclination and something that we should kind of start to see as a kind of a component of our organic architecture. But, as yet, we still kind of hold on to this kind of like hermetic isolationist kind of reality. We've started to append or kind of affix organic components like living walls and kind of things like that onto our buildings, but they kind of are just surface attachments. They kind of have yet to be able to kind of like integrate themselves into the very complex and intricate systems of our buildings. One of the things I think is the next generation is that like someone could basically see an entire body of research, and I'm sure it's out there, it's probably starting, and if it hasn't, I'm sure it will soon, of understanding how to integrate these systems into the systems and maybe find a cost benefit or a kind of like advantage to the way in which they kind of enlist in the kind of, in the health of the building. Now, again, I don't know, but if, anybody listens and knows about these things, because again, I see the academic aspect from a very limited perspective here in New York City and just affiliated with one or two schools. But this is something I would see that certainly didn't exist very long ago. And if it does exist at all, it's kind of existed for a very short period of time. So anyway, based on that, anything you want to add in terms of, or kind of like see as a kind of a deficiency in what I've kind of stated so far, or kind of want to add to anything?
Sure, I have things to add. Okay. There is what I term trophy architecture. And by trophy architecture, I mean a certain sheen of luxury that's applied to, appliances like you were saying, to a certain look, but it's not an informed look. It's a hodgepodge of incredibly overpriced luxury goods that are simply installed in standard rooms. There's no innovation, there's no progress, and I think the basic structures are what they've always been. In fact, I think there was a lot more progress in the 50s and 60s with architectural form, with Frank Lloyd Wright and Bruce Goff and people who really innovated. I mean, a perfect example, well, I don't want to name any architects, not my favorite, but another Frank Gehry building, which looks like, a pile of metal shavings. But if you actually look at photos or have been inside any of the Gehry structures, they're incredibly mundane inside. There's nothing interesting about them. They may look radical outside. They may have a sheen of intrigue, but inside they're far from intriguing. They look like a DMV in Sweden. I mean, there's nothing that is an innovation, and it's all window dressing. And you can stick, marble counters in something, but it doesn't make it a luxury structure or a well-built structure.
Yeah, it's funny because I would agree with that. And to follow up on that, I mean, as coming out of architectural school, early 80s, and then kind of being an academic in the 80s to the 90s, for me, that particular movement was something that always just seemed very silly. And it was like, I guess it was like the deconstructivists or whatever it was called. But it was like, and I found that it was like, there was a Zaha Hadid, and there was a kind of a Coop Himmelblau. Again, I don't want to go too much. Rem Koolhaas, right.
Which they still show his stuff, and it's.
Do they? Is he still alive?
I don't know.
Okay,
but
see,
they
one
had
of the
a show
good.
of his at the Guggenheim, like a year.
Anyway, so as a result, fortunately, a lot of these, these things have kind of become insubstantial. Like we said, I mean, one of the things that was interesting was even in the middle classes, working classes of America, for the most part, the idea of kind of Frank Lloyd Wright, especially Buckminster Fuller, these were people that even people who weren't really into architecture certainly understood the prominence and significance of these people, even if they didn't know the work.
Yeah.
And I'd say, like, probably it was that period, which was the last period of a recognizable household name for architects. Now, I don't know if aside from people I know who are my friends, I probably couldn't name 5 architects, but that's kind of like, because I just don't think they make a compelling, they don't make a compelling argument for their existence. But I do believe that idea there was a sense of kind of hyperbolic extravagance, but there was really no formal invention. There was no innovation. I mean, you had these like somewhat silly looking, like you said, metal shavings or kind of like pencil shavings.
I said,
but
metal shavings.
At the same time, what they did was they still had to kind of deal with the conventionalities of the building. But that's because the conventionalities still basically pertain to this inorganic, hermetic, isolationist, anthropocentric view of reality, which we which is challenged and is changed, but as we in this kind of retrograde fashion refuse to accept. I mean, it was understandable coming out of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century to have this view of humans as a supreme being. And I mean, I remember even when I was in school, a lot of these things were being challenged. In fact, this goes back to a lecture that I gave at the Museum of Natural History, which I think I've talked about before. Whereas, I was kind of asked to give, I said, why is architecture something that's being talked about in a natural history museum? And I said, well, because humans do a fairly good job, as architects, but they're not that great. And it would confused a lot of people. And they were like, what do you mean? I said, well, look, you think of architecture as a human artifact, and I don't see it that way. I see the fact that humans are actually quite poor at it. And then what I did was I introduced the idea of these kind of social insects and other kind of organisms that are kind of much more capable in terms of their architecture or engineering than we are, just in the kind of way in which they conduct themselves. And then by the end of the lecture, there was kind of like somewhat of a kind of a sadness kind of came over the room. I said, but hey, look, in fairness, some of these social insects have had this kind of have been working on this for hundreds of millions of years, whereas we as humans have only been working on this for tens of thousands, possibly maybe more, but not anything that is kind of can possibly. So we'll catch up, but it'll going to take a while because, I mean, wasps and bees and ants and termites, have been at this for a while, and they're smarter than us. They're more capable than us, but we have, I think, done fairly well for the limited amount of time that we've been engaged in this endeavor. We still have a long way to go, but I think one of the things that we've done is we've kind of, because of our poor ability to kind of understand the physical science and the material sciences, we've made a lot of incredibly bad decisions that have kind of continued to isolate us even more. Most of the things that happen in nature are kind of a cyclical or process based. And again, this goes back to my belief in the value of the work of Alfred North Whitehead and process thinking and process reality. And also I came across a gentleman named John Dupre, who is, I guess, he's an interesting character because he deals with metaphysics and he deals with biology, but he was talking about process based circumstance and talked about the idea of the idea of understanding the fact that you have sustainable phases rather than this kind of idea of homeostasis. So the idea of a homeoretic rather than a homeostatic organism, a homeoretic organism as opposed to a homeostatic mechanism is actually the way in which we kind of see these circumstances arising. And I think it's definitely an indicator of something that could be much more beneficial in terms of our thinking. But we're still kind of left in this kind of formal analysis of a kind of idealist state that is an incredibly specious and kind of superficial way of kind of approaching a 21st century reality. Society is not interested. Material science is not interested. The natural world is not interested. And I think it's kind of forced this kind of retrograde circumstance that we need to kind of wake ourselves up from. But like I said, I see these things taking place slowly but surely inside, kind of certain places that I've kind of been fortunate enough to find myself kinship with. So,
would you like me to give an example?
Yeah, sure.
We're sort of past the area we were talking about, but
Mhm.
I wanted to wait till you finished so I didn't interrupt you. So I can give a quick example of what I was talking about a while ago, which were buildings that don't live up to their promise or their function. And in fact, I never got into that, but the idea of a design for a specific function that doesn't live up to the premise of its function and really doesn't serve its use And I will bring up an example. A concert hall has a very particular set of functions. If it fails in those functions, it fails as a concert hall. It can hit all the bells and the whistles of a certain aesthetic shell, but if it doesn't function well for the audience, and I will give two specific examples, one which is very successful and one which is not at all. The not at all is the David Geffen Hall. It's great he gave all the money, and for years and years they closed this concert hall at Lincoln Center, and it reopened with what looks like, a radical interior, actually, interestingly, for a concert hall. But if anyone out there has seen, or more importantly heard, a concert in the new David Geffen Hall that opened up, I guess, about a year ago or
Mm.
so at Lincoln Center, the acoustics are dreadful. It has a tinny sound. It's thin. It has weird echoes. The seats are horribly uncomfortable. The bathrooms are poorly done, where there are giant lines, uh, not enough facilities for the seats, so they jammed a lot of seats in there to sell a lot of high priced tickets, but without the support structures or facilities. It's a very labyrinthine place, without a lot of sense. It's very chilly aesthetically, um, and the certain instruments really don't sound very good. One of which are the wind instruments sound awful there. I mean, if you've heard any concerts with oboes or clarinets or flutes, the sound is dreadful. Entire registers are absent from the
Jesus.
acoustic range.
Hmm.
And that's my very informed opinion. A very successful version of a concert hall is Alice Tully Hall, one block north,
Mm.
which is it's a much smaller place, but it's also a much more successful place. I believe it's Cherrywood. It's warm and inviting, although it's missing a central aisle, which is very problematic for
Mm.
40 seats, but the acoustics are dreamy. The
Mm.
sound of everything from a cello to a piano, and they actually refitted and refurbished their organ, which is an entire wall,
Mm.
actually.
Mm.
It's actually a hidden organ cloaked behind the wall panels, and I'm not a huge organ fan, but this organ was phenomenal. I mean, you could hear the chords, you could feel them in your gut. It was
Mm.
uh, perfect acoustics. I've seen and heard opera singers there to accompany chamber works. I mean, it's
Mm.
pretty much for chamber music.
Yeah.
Yeah,
As a chamber hall, I think it's quite phenomenal. In fact, like we were there
yeah.
last
So
week,
if you'd
and we'll
like
be
to
there
talk
again this
about
week.
it,
No, no.
yeah.
I mean, were you finished?
I only had one more
Okay,
thing
go
to
ahead. Go ahead.
say,
Okay.
that the primary drive, to quote Star Trek, the prime directive were beautiful, full range acoustics where every instrument and every note could stand on a pedestal. And I think Alice Tully Hall is hugely successful. You could hear a pin drop. I mean, the clarity is breathtaking.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't been to David Geffen Hall. I guess we'll be going this week. I mean, we're
Yeah,
going there for Anna Klein.
yeah, on
Yeah.
Wednesday.
And I mean, the good thing is, like, fortunately, we're going to see in Balsagev on Tuesday in Chambers.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think that for me, the success of Alice Tully Hall is the fact that the sound is very clear and it's not confusing. And I think because with chamber work specifically, everything has to be, there's nowhere to hide. When you're playing chamber music, everything, every little piece, every little, because it's so intricate, complex, there's no place to hide. Everything counts. In a symphony, it's so grand. There's a lot of places where you kind of like, well, did I hear that or didn't have? No, and you can kind of get overwhelmed. I haven't heard anyone say anything positive about David Geffen Hall. In fact, most have heard either nothing. And considering how much time and attention and money was put towards it, I kind of felt as if like, it's obviously not be as successful as it could be. Now, again, I use the example of the Hubble Space Telescope. When it first went up into space, it was a disaster because there was like, some minuscule, insignificant, what we would say not even perceptible anomaly in the surface of the mirror that basically caused for all kinds of distortions, which basically they had to eliminate over the years with software.
Retrofitted, didn't it?
Right. Yes. Right. And in fact, I think the Mike Massimino kind of group, with all that crew, they had done some things to kind of like be able to kind of install some software to make corrections in the information so it wasn't solely dependent on the mirror itself. So getting to the conclude here, I think one of the things that's important to understand is the fact that we have not really looked at these fundamental flaws, or let's say fundamental premises that may or may not really still be relevant to us, that kind of do not allow us to kind of engage in a greater endeavor in architectural kind of like generation. So once we kind of start to deal with some of these things, like the idea that we have this hermetic, isolationist, anthropocentric circumstance that basically puts itself against the rest of the universe rather than tries to kind of integrate it. And I don't mean, this kind of like cutesy, fanciful, kind of like what they call contextual kind of understanding or appreciation. No, I'm talking about actually kind of like being part of an ecosystem. I mean, we have zero biotic reality, and it's like if there is, it's, as I said, it's an accidental domestication, or it's a kind of an off gas, so we have never really been able to kind of look at the fact that, for me, when I look at a forest, there's a kind of like a series of kind of like stabilized circumstance that exist and kind of are in this kind of endless process of networks that kind of overlapped and interweave with each other. One of the things I think that's happened is we're starting to see the fact that like the idea of symbiosis in itself as a kind of like scientific strategy has kind of engaged beyond the simple kind of circumstance of kind of like parasitism. And I think, our obsession with that may come from this kind of almost Victorian idea of like, it's us against them. And, I can understand, given the fact that like there have been circumstances that have given us this belief that we stand atop the natural kind of like hierarchy, and therefore can isolate ourselves and kind of protect ourselves from the rest. But there's a difference between kind of saving yourself from being eaten by a lion and kind of like appreciating the fact that there's a kind of more holistic way in which one can have a healthy relationship with your environment. So next week, let's see, what's the topic for next week? Okay, it is honesty as it relates to discourse. And then follow that with the loss of 2D design. Oh, and then, okay, we're going to talk about in an American architecture, a truly organic impulse. We'll kind of go back to some of our things that we've been talking about. But I think for this, I think that's really kind of it. So I think we've seen some of these situations. And I think until we kind of can get past, I remember one of the things I used to say as a professor was, because everyone was always obsessed with process. But the thing is, the process wasn't really process. It was more just kind of like procedures. And the procedures kind of always seemed to kind of end up with the same artifacts. And I said, even if your procedures that you engage in, right, in terms of your generative strategy, are in fact unique or innovative? Why is it that I see the exact same artifacts being produced? And I think that's just it. So aside from, like, as Julie was saying, rightfully so, some kind of like, kind of different wrappings of the packages, why is the gift the same? It's like we've been given, it's kind of like that Christmas present that every year you get a tie, and it's like, but it's in a different box.
Every year I get a fruit cake at Christmas.
Yeah, exactly, but it's in a different box.
They're hard as rocks,
Yeah.
but they're all in really great boxes.
Yeah, they're all in great boxes. Exactly. So you kind of think to yourself, it's like, okay, we need to, and again, like I said, I have no particular concern with these other engagements. It's just that, since I decided to kind of move off in the end of in 1990 and kind of go in my own direction, I've kind of seen that it was right to do so, because now as I've seen this enterprise kind of that I left kind of collapse and kind of show that it had very little justification for its existence and has produced nothing of real consequence, I don't feel I missed anything. But I do feel as if
there aren't even jobs now.
No, that's true. That's what all these architects are saying. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So I think we kind of gave that a kind of full approach. We kind of gave, so as always, the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all of us to maintain that. Thank you.
Thank you. Good tip.